The high scion of the Vexel Concordance, Thrax, felt the immense, cold weight of the chamber of resonant judgment press down upon him, a pressure born not of its cavernous architecture, but of the silence that now filled it. The crystalline walls, usually alive with the soft, internal light of 1,000 shifting constellations, were dimmed to a deep, mournful violet, mirroring the gravity of their assembly. Below his floating dais, the tiered levels of the chamber held the most powerful figures in the concordance, their multifaceted eyes fixed upon the singular, terrifying image suspended in the hollow field at the room's heart. It was a vessel, derelict and silent, adrift in the ghost-haunted currents of the Veil of Embers, a region of space long declared forbidden, a tombstone for a civilization that had burned too brightly and vanished too completely. It was a human warship. The word itself was a heresy, a name spoken only in hushed archives and in the most dire of strategic simulations. Humanity, the great, unanswered question of the galaxy. They had erupted onto the cosmic stage with a ferocity and brilliance that had shattered the established order, their expansion a wildfire that consumed everything it touched. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone, leaving behind only scarred worlds, abandoned megastructures that defied Vexel physics, and a legacy of such profound terror and awe that it had shaped the Concordance's foreign policy for millennia. The ship was an artifact of that terrifying age, a relic of a power that had once made the stars themselves seem to tremble. Its design was an offense to Vexel aesthetics and a nightmare to their engineers. It was brutalist, a thing of sharp angles and dense, unreadable alloys, possessing none of the graceful, sweeping lines that characterized the Concordance fleet. It was a predator's form, a shape built not for travel, but for endurance and violence. For weeks it had drifted, tumbling slowly through the nebulous dust of the Veil, its presence a gravitational anomaly that had pulled at the Concordance's deepest fears. And now, the debate that had raged in hushed, frantic whispers had finally spilled into the open, here in the sanctum of their power. "We have studied the energy signatures, or the lack thereof," began a voice from the lower tiers, that of high technocrat Valerius, his form shimmering with the embedded data links that were his station. "The vessel is cold. Life support is non-existent. The primary drive is a dead singularity, radiating only faint, residual decay. It is a ghost, high scion, a corpse." His tone was meant to be reassuring, to strip the object of its mythic power and reduce it to a mere collection of inert matter. But the tremor in his subvocalizations betrayed him. No one could look upon that shape and see only matter. They saw a symbol. From the opposite side of the chamber, the formidable silhouette of Grand Marshal Kale stirred. His carapace was a deep martial crimson, scarred from campaigns that had secured the Concordance's borders against lesser threats. He did not fear ghosts. He feared unpreparedness. "A corpse may still hold a venomous sting," Kale's voice boomed, resonating from the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. "For cycles, our long-range auguries have detected whispers from the Veil. Faint, structured signals that our astromancers dismissed as stellar phenomena. Now we find this monument to our ignorance. I say we cannot afford to leave it unexamined. The humans were masters of technologies that remain theoretical to us. If that ship contains a weapon, a power source, a historical record that could explain their disappearance, we have a duty to secure it." A murmur of assent rippled through the military echelons seated around Kale, a wave of agreement that washed against the silent caution of the diplomatic and scientific corps. Thrax watched the divide, the ancient schism in the Vexel soul between the warrior's impulse to conquer and the scholar's desire to understand. He himself stood in the chasm between, a fulcrum upon which the fate of his people now balanced. He turned his gaze to the figure seated just to his right, her form slender and cloaked in the silver robes of the emissary corps. Lyra, the first emissary, had not yet spoken, her multifaceted eyes, a rare and startling shade of sapphire, fixed on the holographic ghost ship with an unnerving intensity. "First emissary," Thrax projected, his own voice a carefully modulated baritone that carried the weight of his office. "You have counseled patience. Grand Marshal Kale advocates for action. The Concordance is divided. Guide our judgment." Lyra rose slowly, the silver fabric of her robes whispering against the crystalline flooring of the dais. She did not look at the assembly, but continued to stare at the human vessel, as if trying to divine its secrets through sheer force of will. "Grand Marshal," she began, her voice soft yet carrying to every co. Arnur of the immense chamber, you speak of securing a weapon. Have you considered that the ship itself might be the weapon? Not in the conventional sense, but as a lure. A trap left behind by a mind far more patient and perhaps far more cruel than our own. Kale let out a sharp exhalation of compressed air, the vexil equivalent of a scoff. A trap left dormant for thousands of years? For what purpose? The humans are gone, their empire is dust. Their great war, whatever it was, is over. We are picking through the bones of their legacy, not facing their living armies. Are we? Lyra countered, finally turning her sapphire gaze from the hologram to lock onto the Grand Marshal. We know nothing for certain. The archives are fragmented, contradictory. Some accounts paint the humans as ravenous conquerors. Others speak of them as desperate defenders in a war against a foe so terrible we have no name for it. We see this ship as a relic, a source of potential power. But what if it is a tomb or a quarantine marker? What if the very reason for its silence, its coldness, is a warning? A warning that something within it should never, ever be disturbed. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Lyra had touched the core of their collective dread. The disappearance of humanity was the great, unresolved horror of galactic history. A species capable of engineering stars and weaving spacetime had vanished at the zenith of their power. Such an event was not natural. It was an act of cosmic violence on a scale that dwarfed any of the Concordance's petty border skirmishes. To willingly touch an artifact from that cataclysmic era felt like sacrilege. It felt like tempting a fate that had already consumed gods. Thrax felt the weight of their gazes upon him. He had to make a decision. The pressure from the military was immense. The strategic advantage of reverse engineering human technology was incalculable. It could secure Vexil dominance for eons. But Lyra's words resonated with his own deep-seated unease. The Vexil were a cautious people. They had risen to power not through reckless expansion, but through careful observation, meticulous planning, and an abiding respect for the unknown. Humanity had been the ultimate unknown. The risk is not an action, Kale pressed, sensing the high scion's hesitation. The risk is in inaction. If we leave the vessel untouched, another, less scrupulous power might find it. The corsairs of the Outer Rim, the ever-scheming houses of the Siren hegemony. Imagine human weaponry in their hands. The destabilization would shatter the fragile peace we have built. We must be the ones to control this narrative, to control this power. Thrax considered the Grand Marshal's point. It was a sound, logical argument rooted in the political realities of their galactic neighborhood. And yet, it felt hollow, a rationalization that willfully ignored the deeper, existential terror the human ship represented. He looked back at the hologram, at the jagged, silent form that seemed to absorb the light around it. It did not look like a prize. It looked like a scar on the fabric of space. We will not be reckless, Thrax announced, his voice firm, leaving no room for further debate. But we will not be paralyzed by fear. We will send an expedition. A single, specialized vessel. Not a warship Grand Marshal, he added, cutting off Kale's inevitable protest, but a scientific scout, the Stardust Drifter. Its crew will be composed of our finest xenotechnologists and historians, under the command of a mind that respects the gravity of this mission. He paused, letting his decision settle over the chamber. The mission will be one of pure reconnaissance, no invasive actions. They will approach, they will scan, they will observe. They will not, under any circumstances, attempt to board the vessel unless the data confirms, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that it is truly and completely inert. And First Emissary Lyra, you will oversee this mission personally from the Stardust Drifter. Your wisdom will be our shield. A wave of shock rippled through the assembly. To send the First Emissary, their chief diplomat, and a figure of immense cultural importance, into the Forbidden Vale was unprecedented. Kale's mandibles clenched in a gesture of suppressed fury. The decision was a clear rebuke of his aggressive posture, placing the mission firmly under the control of the cautious diplomatic corps. Lyra, however, merely inclined her head in a gesture of acceptance, her sapphire eyes betraying no surprise, only a deep, solemn resolve. She had known this would be the price of her counsel. To advocate for caution, she would have to be the one to stand at the precipice of the danger itself. As the High Scion dissolved the assembly, the great hollow field shimmered and the image of the human warship vanished, returning the chamber to its ambient, star-filled glow. But the afterimage remained, burned into the minds of all hoo-ha. Deben present, the dark, silent shape, adrift in a sea of dead stars, waiting. For what, none of them knew. But as Thrax retreated to his private spire, looking out over the gleaming, orderly perfection of the Vexel homeworld, he could not shake the feeling that they had just set in motion a chain of events that had been lying in wait for thousands of years, a sleeping beast that their curiosity was about to foolishly prod awake. The silence from the Veil of Embers suddenly felt less like an absence and more like a held breath. The journey to the Veil of Embers was undertaken with a solemnity that bordered on religious reverence. The Stardust Drifter, a vessel designed for deep space exploration and first contact, was a jewel of Vexel engineering, its sleek, organic form a stark contrast to the brutalist architecture of their target. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of scholarly excitement and primal dread. First emissary Lyra stood on the observation deck, a curved expanse of transparent crystal that looked out onto the swirling, chaotic beauty of hyperspace. The ship's command crew, a hand-picked selection of the Concordance's most brilliant and level-headed minds, worked at their consoles in focused silence, their movements precise and economical. They were the best of the best, yet every one of them felt the oppressive weight of their destination. The Veil of Embers was more than just a region of space. It was a graveyard. Millennia ago, it had been a vibrant sector, dense with young, bright stars. The fragmented records of the era, salvaged from civilizations that had long since turned to dust, spoke of a sudden, catastrophic event. Stars had aged and died in the span of years, not eons. Planets had been rendered barren, their atmospheres stripped away by waves of exotic radiation. And at the heart of it all had been the war. The human war. A conflict fought with weapons that seemed to unravel the laws of physics, leaving behind not just wreckage, but wounds in the fabric of spacetime itself. The Veil was one such wound, a place where the universe was still healing. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace, the silence on the bridge was absolute. The view outside the main portal was breathtaking and terrifying. They were floating in a sea of dark, bloated stars, ancient red giants that cast a bloody, spectral light on the swirling clouds of dust and gas that choked the region. And there, exactly where their long-range auguries had predicted, hung the human warship. It was larger than the scans had suggested. Impossibly so, it was a mountain of metal, a floating continent of silent, dark alloy. As the Stardust Drifter began its slow, cautious approach, its array of active and passive sensors began to paint a more detailed picture, and the mystery only deepened. The ship's hull was not merely smooth, it was seamless, as if forged from a single, continuous piece of material. There were no visible weapon emplacements, no sensor arrays, no docking bays. Just a monolithic, angular expanse of blackness that seemed to drink the faint, red light of the dying stars. Energy readings remained non-existent, the head of Xenotechnology, a Vexel named Cygnus, reported, his voice a low, awestruck whisper. Gravimetric signature is consistent with its estimated mass, but there are anomalies, pockets of localized spacetime distortion deep within the hull. It's as if small, contained singularities are woven into its very structure. Not for power, but for structural integrity. It's a design philosophy that is utterly alien. Life signs? Lyra asked, her gaze never leaving the colossal shape that now filled the view screen. Not even microbial. The interior is a hard vacuum and the temperature is near absolute zero. It is as dead as the space around it, Cygnus confirmed, but his claws hesitated over his console. However, there is a single, infinitesimally faint energy source, a directed neutrino stream originating from the central section of the ship. It is incredibly weak, barely above the background radiation of the cosmos. It isn't a power source. It's more like a biological nerve impulse. A heartbeat, one that beats once every 1,000 years. The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. A heartbeat. The word was unsettlingly organic. A machine was not supposed to have a heartbeat. For days, they circled the behemoth, their scans growing ever more detailed, their confusion ever more profound. They mapped its strange internal geometry, the impossible angles of its corridors, the vast, empty caverns that could have held entire Vexel cities. They found no engines they could recognize, no bridge, no crew quarters. The ship was a black box, a puzzle box of unimaginable scale and complexity. The pressure from the Concordance was mounting. Grand Marshal Kale, his patience wearing thin, was sending daily communiques, demanding more decisive action. The scientific imperative was undeniable. The risque of leaving such a prize unexamined was becoming, in the minds of many back home, greater than the risk of exploring it. Finally, after a long, silent conference with high scion Thrax, the decision was made. Lyra was to lead a small, specialized team to board the vessel. The objective was still strictly reconnaissance, but the parameters had shifted. They were to enter, if possible, and gather direct data. It was a mission that every member of the Vexel team simultaneously craved and feared. The boarding process itself was a testament to the ship's alien design. There were no airlocks, no hatches. After days of fruitless searching, it was a high-frequency resonance scan that revealed the secret. A specific section of the hull, when subjected to a precise sonic frequency, did not open, but phased. The seamless black alloy dissolved into a shimmering, permeable field of energy, revealing a dark, cavernous opening beyond. It was not a door, it was a wound, temporarily opened in the ship's skin. Lyra stood at the threshold, flanked by Cygnus and two heavily armored security specialists. They were clad in advanced environmental suits, designed to withstand the harshest conditions the galaxy could offer. But Lyra knew that no armor could protect them from the crushing psychological weight of this place. She took a steadying breath of the suit's recycled air and stepped through the shimmering portal. The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was a perfect, absolute silence that was somehow deeper than the vacuum of space they had left behind. The airless corridor beyond was vast, its walls angled in ways that defied Vexel spatial reasoning. The floor was made of the same seamless black material as the hull, and it seemed to absorb the light from their helmet lamps, casting their surroundings in an oppressive gloom. There was no dust, no debris, no sign of the passage of time. The interior was as pristine and sterile as the day it had been sealed. They proceeded with agonizing slowness, their magnetic boots clamping onto the floor with soft, metallic clicks that were the only sounds in this dead world. They were trespassers in a mausoleum, intruders in a temple dedicated to a forgotten god of war. The sheer scale of the place was disorienting. They passed through chambers so large that their lights could not find the ceiling, rooms filled with strange, inert crystalline structures that pulsed with a faint, internal light when their scanners passed over them. It was clear that this was not merely a warship. It was something more. An ark, perhaps, a library. Cygnus was in a state of rapturous terror, his instruments recording data streams so complex and revolutionary that they would occupy Vexel scientists for generations. "First emissary," he whispered over their private comm channel, his voice trembling with awe, "the metallurgical composition of these walls, it's not stable matter. It's a state of matter held in perfect equilibrium by the micro-singularities I detected. This entire ship, it's a controlled paradox. It shouldn't exist." They followed the faint neutrino stream, the ship's ghostly heartbeat, deeper into the labyrinthine structure. The source seemed to be emanating from what their scans identified as the ship's central core, a spherical chamber located at the precise geometric center of the vessel. As they approached, a new sensation began to intrude upon their senses. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A low, pervasive hum that resonated not in their ears, but directly in the bones of their skulls. It was a feeling of immense, sleeping power. The entrance to the central chamber was unguarded, a simple, unadorned archway that opened into a vast, spherical space. The team paused at the threshold, their lights playing over the scene within. The chamber was empty, save for a single object at its very center, a raised, circular platform of the same black, seamless material. And upon that platform, bathed in a soft, ethereal blue light that emanated from the platform itself, stood a single, motionless figure. It was a human. The security team instinctively raised their pulse rifles, their combat reflexes overriding the sheer impossibility of the sight. Lyra held up a hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. The human was tall and slender, encased in a form-fitting suit of a material that seemed to shift between liquid silver and deep black. The suit was featureless, save for a smooth, opaque helmet that concealed the face within. The figure was utterly still, its posture one of serene, patient waiting. It was not a corpse. The energy readings, though faint, were undeniable. This being was alive. For a long moment, no one moved. The Vexel stood frozen at the entrance, a tableau of disbelief and terror. The human remained on the platform, a silent, silver statue. Was this a guard, a prisoner, a survivor who had been in some form of stasis for untold millennia? Slowly, deliberately, Lyra took a step into the chamber. The security team tensed, but she motioned for them to stand down. She had to know. This was the moment that would define not just their mission, but the future of the Concordance. She walked towards the center of the room, her magnetic boots clicking with agonizing loudness in the profound silence. She stopped a respectful distance from the platform, her mind racing, trying to formulate the first words that would be spoken between a Vexel and a living human in thousands of years. But before she could speak, the helmet of the silver suit retracted, dissolving into the collar with a silent, fluid motion. The face it revealed was not what she had expected. It was a face that was neither old nor young, its features possessing a kind of sculpted, timeless perfection. Its skin was pale, its hair a short-cropped shock of pure white, but it was the eyes that held her captive. They were a calm, clear gray, and they regarded her not with hostility or surprise, but with a deep, ancient, and immeasurable sadness. And then a voice spoke, not through the airless chamber, but directly inside their minds. It was a calm, resonant voice, a voice that felt as old as the stars, yet was filled with a gentle, disarming warmth. "You are not who I was expecting," the voice said, a thought that bloomed in their consciousness as clear as spoken language. "But you are welcome. I have been waiting for a very long time." The shock of the telepathic communication was so profound that one of the security guards stumbled back, his rifle clattering against his armored suit. Lyra, however, held her ground, her diplomatic training kicking in, a thin veneer of professionalism over a roiling sea of astonishment. She gathered her thoughts, forming a reply in her own mind, hoping this strange, ancient being could receive it. Who are you?" she projected, her mental voice a whisper of awe and fear. The human's gray eyes softened, a faint, sad smile touching its lips. "I am the custodian of this vessel. It has another name, but you may call it Vigilance. And my purpose is to stand watch, to remember, and to wait." "Wait for what?" Lyra asked, taking another cautious step forward. Cygnus was frantically trying to analyze the being, but his instruments were returning only nonsense, as if the human existed in a state that was both biological and something else entirely. "For someone to come," the custodian replied, its gaze sweeping over the Vexel team, its expression one of serene, scholarly curiosity. "Someone with the wisdom to see this ship not as a weapon, but as a warning, and the courage to listen to the story it has to tell." The custodian's mental voice filled the minds of the Vexel boarding party, a calm, flowing river of information and sorrow. It was not a simple transfer of data. It was a sharing of experience, a tapestry of memories woven with the emotional gravity of a species that had faced the ultimate abyss. Lyra found herself standing not in a cold, metal chamber, but on the shores of a forgotten world watching twin suns set over a crystalline ocean. She felt the warmth of a culture at its zenith, a civilization that had mastered matter and energy, that had turned its gaze outward not for conquest, but for the sheer, unadulterated joy of discovery. She saw cities that sang, ships that moved like thought, and a people who had believed themselves to be on the verge of unlocking the final, fundamental secrets of the cosmos. Then the darkness came. The custodian did not give it a name. He called it only the Scourge. It was not an invading fleet, not a rival empire. It was a subtle, insidious corruption of reality itself. It had arrived from the void between galaxies, a wave of non-existence that targeted not matter, but consciousness. It was a mimetic plague, a philosophical contagion that unraveled the very axioms of thought. Civilizations touched by it did not die in fire and explosions, they simply stopped. Their art became meaningless patterns. Their science devolved into paradoxical loops. Their people would stand in their perfect cities and stare into space, their minds erased, their souls hollowed out, until their bodies simply withered away. It was a quiet, creeping apocalypse, an entropy of the spirit. Humanity, with its deeply interconnected neural networks and its boundless curiosity, had been particularly vulnerable. The scourge had spread through their civilization like a ghost, leaving entire star systems populated by silent, walking shells. The war that followed, the one that had scarred the Vale of Embers, had not been a war of fleets and armies in the way the Vexel understood it. It had been a war of ideas, a war of sanity against unbeing. The humans had fought back, not with weapons that destroyed planets, but with weapons that shielded minds, that reinforced the fragile structures of logic and reason. They had built fortresses in spacetime, quarantine zones of absolute causal law to hold back the tide of existential chaos. "We built this ship," the custodian's thought echoed, pulling Lyra back to the present, the phantom images of burning nebulae and silent cities fading from her mind. The Vigilance, and others like it. They were not weapons of aggression. They were sanctuaries, arcs. We called them the last bastions. Their purpose was to carry the memory of what we were, the sum total of our knowledge, our art, our philosophy, sealed away from the influence of the scourge. Cygnus, the xenotechnologist, was trembling, his mind reeling from the sheer conceptual weight of what he was being shown. You quarantined yourselves," he projected, his thought tinged with disbelief. "You abandoned your empire." A wave of profound loss washed over them from the custodian, a grief so ancient and so deep that it felt like a physical force. "We had no choice. To continue to exist in the open was to continue to be a target, a potential vector for the scourge's spread. We discovered that the contagion was drawn to complex, high-order consciousness. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it cast. Our very existence was a beacon for this cosmic apathy. So we made a choice. The great sacrifice, we called it." The custodian's gray eyes seemed to look through them, into the past. "Some of us retreated into shielded dimensions, pocket universes where we could ride out the storm. Others sublimated their consciousness into pure data, stored in vessels like this one, to wait for the galaxy to heal. And the rest, the vast majority of our species, willingly underwent a process of cognitive simplification. A voluntary retreat from the complexities of higher thought, a devolution into simpler, less vulnerable forms of life, seated on 1,000,000 protected worlds. We did not go extinct. We hid. We hid within ourselves and within the silence of deep space." Lyra felt a sense of awe so profound it bordered on terror. The Vexil had built their entire galactic strategy around the assumption that humanity had been a rival to be feared, a predator that had been mysteriously slain. The reality was so much grander, so much more tragic, and so much more noble. They hadn't been conquered. They had sacrificed an empire to protect the very concept of life in the galaxy. They had been guardians. This vessel, Lyra thought, her mind struggling to encompass the scale of it all. Why was it left here, in the Veil? "The Veil of Embers was the site of our last stand," the custodian explained. "The final battle where we deployed the paracausal array, a device that did not destroy the scourge but locked it in a temporal stasis field. The energy release shattered this sector, aged its stars, and created the wound in spacetime you see today. But it worked. It contained the primary infection. This ship, the Vigilance, was left behind as a sentinel, a tombstone and a watchtower. My purpose is to maintain the integrity of the stasis field's energy matrix, and to wait for a species to evolve that was sophisticated enough to find this ship, but wise enough not to try and use it as a weapon." The custodian's gaze settled on Lyra, a calm, appraising look that seemed to peer into her very soul. "Your people approached with caution. You studied, you observed. You did not come with warships and overwhelming force. You came with curiosity and a respect for the unknown. For millennia, I have watched the void. Other races have passed through the fringes of the veil. Some were too primitive to detect us. Others were too aggressive, their intentions transparently hostile. They were allowed to pass by, their sensors subtly diverted, their minds gently persuaded that there was nothing here to see. You, the Vexil, are the first to pass the test." A silence settled in the chamber, a silence now filled not with emptiness, but with the weight of revelation. The entire foundation of Vexil history, their understanding of their place in the universe, had been built on a lie. They were not the inheritors of a fallen empire. They were the children playing in the shadow of a sleeping giant, a giant who had fought a war for their very right to exist and had never asked for thanks. "The last weapon," Lyra whispered aloud, the words escaping her lips before she could form them in her mind. The phrase from their ancient, fearful legends, humanity's last weapon. The custodian's sad smile returned. "We had many weapons, weapons that could unmake stars, that could rewrite the past. But our last and greatest weapon was never a thing of power or destruction. It was an idea." The blue light from the platform beneath the custodian intensified, and the air in the center of the chamber shimmered. Holographic images bloomed around them, not of battles or warships, but of complex equations, galactic maps overlaid with intricate energy patterns, and charts of cosmic evolution. The scourge was not defeated. The custodian's thought grew more urge. NT, the gentle sadness replaced by a steely resolve. It was merely contained. The stasis field is not permanent. Over cosmological timescales, it will decay. The containment is failing, slowly but inexorably. Humanity's last weapon was knowledge, the knowledge of the true enemy, the schematics for the technologies needed to fight it, the history of our failures and our successes, a legacy passed on. That is the weapon, the truth. And you, first emissary Lyra of the Vexel Concordance, are its intended heir. Lyra stared at the swirling, impossibly complex data around her, feeling like a novice standing before an infinite library. She looked at the two heavily armed guards behind her, their pulse rifles now seeming like children's toys. She thought of Grand Marshal Kale, back on the homeworld, so eager to claim this ship for its military might. He had been looking for a sword, and he had found a map that showed a tidal wave poised to consume the entire world. "What do you want from us?" Lyra projected, her mind humbled, her spirit overwhelmed. "Want?" The custodian seemed to consider the concept. "I want nothing. I am a memory, a caretaker. But humanity, my creators, they hoped. They hoped that the next great civilization to rise in the galaxy would be one that learned from our arrogance. They hoped for partners, not to refight our war, but to begin a new one, a war of preservation. A war to protect the sanctity of consciousness against the silent, creeping void." The custodian raised a hand, and a single, glowing orb of light detached from the holographic display and floated towards Lyra. It pulsed with a soft, white light, containing within its matrix a dizzying quantity of information. It was the key, the archive, the legacy of humanity. "The choice is yours," the custodian's voice echoed in their minds, a final, solemn pronouncement. "You can take this knowledge and hide as we once did. You can try to wield it for conquest and power, and in doing so, you will surely fall to the same hubris that almost destroyed us. Or, you can accept the burden. You can become the new custodians, the new sentinels. Humanity's watch is over. Yours may be just beginning." Lyra looked at the glowing orb, then back at the ancient, lonely figure of the human. She saw not a threat, not a rival, but a kindred spirit, a reflection of the Vexel's own highest ideals of wisdom and preservation. In that moment, the fear that had haunted her people for millennia finally evaporated, replaced by a sense of profound, terrifying, and exhilarating purpose. They had come to the Vale of Embers seeking answers about the past, and had instead found a destiny for their future. She reached out her hand, and with a reverence she had never before known, accepted the light. The return to the Vexel homeworld was a silent, somber affair. The data core gifted by the custodian, a sphere of living light and condensed information, rested in a specially prepared containment field in the center of the Stardust Drifter's bridge. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light, a new heart for a new age. Lyra had spent the entire journey in communion with it, her mind carefully guided through the vast, complex archives by the custodian's distant consciousness. She had witnessed the full, unvarnished history of humanity's rise and fall, their triumphs and their follies. She had studied the physics of the scourge, a nightmare of mimetic engineering and ontological warfare that made the Concordance's most advanced weapons seem like sharpened sticks. And she had seen the blueprints for the shield, the technologies of preservation and mental fortitude that were humanity's true legacy. When she finally stood once more in the chamber of resonant judgment, she was not the same person who had left. The weight of millennia was upon her, the burden of a forgotten war now resting squarely on her shoulders. The chamber was packed, every dignitary, every marshal, every scholar of the Concordance present. The air was thick with anticipation. At the center of the room, the hollow field did not show a ghost ship, but was instead connected directly to the data core, which now hovered in its place, its white light bathing the chamber in a pure, analytical glow. High Scion Thrax regarded her from his dais, his expression unreadable. To his side, Grand Marshal Kale stood rigid, his crimson carapace seeming to radiate impatience and suspicion. He had been furious at the lack of military intelligence, the absence of weapon schematics in Lyra's preliminary reports. He could not comprehend a power that was not measured in megatons and fleet dispositions. "First emissary," Thrax's voice boomed, imbued with a solemnity that silenced the last whispers in the chamber. "You have returned from the Vale. You have communed with the ghost of our past. The Concordance awaits your report. What have you found?" Lyra did not speak at first. She simply gestured to the glowing sphere. Hi Cyan Gra. N.D. Marshall, members of the Concordance, I have found the truth. And the truth is that our entire history has been a misunderstanding. We have lived our lives in the shadow of a mountain, believing it to be a volcano, when in fact it was a shield wall, protecting us from a storm we never knew existed. She began to speak, her voice calm and clear, but filled with an emotional gravity that held every being in the chamber spellbound. She did not use her own words, but let the data core project the images and memories directly from the custodian's archive. The chamber was filled with the sights and sounds of humanity's golden age, the silent horror of the Scourge's advance, and the terrible, noble calculus of the great sacrifice. They watched as stars were woven into defensive shields, as minds were fortified with logic bombs, and as an entire species chose legacy over existence. A profound, shattering silence fell over the Vexel. The military echelons, who had seen humanity as a worthy, if vanished, foe, now looked upon the images with a kind of horrified reverence. The scientists and scholars were weeping openly, their minds struggling to process the sheer scale of the science and philosophy being unveiled. This was not the history of arrival, it was a sacred text. Grand Marshal Kale was the first to break the silence, his voice rough with disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. This scourge, it was contained. You are saying the threat is over? He was grasping for a tangible conclusion, a problem that could be declared solved. No, Grand Marshal, Lyra replied, her sapphire eyes finding his. The custodian was clear. The containment is a temporary measure on a cosmological scale. It is failing, slowly but inevitably. The whispers our astromancers have been detecting from the void are not echoes of the past. They are the sounds of the prison bars beginning to buckle. She let that sink in. The existential dread that had once been focused on the specter of humanity was now transferred to a far greater, far more insidious foe. They had feared the ghost in the machine, only to discover that the entire house was built on haunted ground. Humanity's last weapon was not a device, Lyra continued, her voice rising with purpose. It was a covenant, a promise left for their successors. They left us the knowledge to understand the enemy, the tools to build the defenses, and a warning that to face this threat, we must be united, not just as a concordance, but as a galaxy. They learned, too late, that division, conquest, and empire are luxuries that life cannot afford in a universe that contains the scourge. We must not make the same mistake. High Cyan Thrax had remained silent throughout the presentation, his ancient face a mask of deep contemplation. He rose from his throne, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of his people. He looked at the martial pride of his generals, now humbled. He looked at the academic arrogance of his scientists, now awestruck. He saw a people on the precipice of a fundamental transformation. For thousands of years, Thrax began, his voice resonating with the full authority of his office, we have defined ourselves by our strength. We have measured our worth by the territory we control and the rivals we have surpassed. We looked upon the legacy of humanity and saw only a cautionary tale of overreach, a reminder that all empires eventually fall. He paused, his eyes settling on the glowing data core. We were fools, blinded by our own ambition. Humanity did not fall, they ascended. They ascended to a level of sacrifice and responsibility we have yet to comprehend. They did not leave us a ruin to be plundered, but a torch to be carried, a vigil to be kept. He turned to Grand Marshal Kale. Marshal, your fleets are the pride of the Concordance, but their mission is about to change. They will no longer be instruments of expansion, but of protection. Their new purpose will be to seek out the other fledgling civilizations of this galaxy, not to conquer or intimidate, but to prepare them. To unify them, we must build the alliance that humanity could not. Kale, for the first time in his long and storied career, looked not like a warrior, but like a student. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, unhesitating assent. It will be done, High Cyan. Thrax then turned to Lyra, a new light in his ancient eyes. First emissary, your mission is far from over. You will take the knowledge from the custodian and establish a new order within the Concordance. The Order of the Vigil. Your task will be to prepare our minds, our culture, for the long watch ahead. You will teach us what it means to be a shield. Lyra bowed, a sense of immense, crushing yet hopeful weight settling upon her. I will not fail, High Scion. It was in that moment of unity, of a civilization finding a new and noble purpose, that the final, most profound twist was delivered. As if responding to the shift in the chamber's emotional and intellectual resonance, the data core flared, its white light intensifying. A new stream of information poured forth, a message that the custodian had held back, a final revelation reserved only for those who had accepted the initial burden. A new image formed in the holofield, overriding the historical archives. It was not a star chart of their galaxy. It was a map of the local galactic cluster, showing their own spiral galaxy and its distant neighbors. A faint signal, a complex, repeating pattern, was highlighted, emanating not from the Scourge's prison, but from the unimaginable darkness of the intergalactic void. This is the final piece of the legacy. The custodian's voice echoed directly into the minds of every being in the chamber, a thought that was both a revelation and a new, deeper mystery. The Scourge, it was not a natural phenomenon. It was engineered, a weapon, deployed by another intelligence in a war that predates our own by billions of years. The image on the map zoomed in on the source of the signal. It was a colossal, dark object, a structure so vast it dwarfed entire star systems. A perfect, spherical void in the fabric of spacetime, surrounded by a lattice of captured galaxies. A megastructure on a scale that defied all known physics. We detected this signal only in our final days. The custodian's thought continued, laced with an ancient awe. It is not a message of aggression. We believe it is a distress call. The creators of the Scourge may have lost control of their own weapon, or perhaps they too were victims of an even greater power. The signal is a warning, a plea for help, and a set of coordinates. The chamber was utterly silent, the Vexil transfixed by the impossible image. They had just come to terms with a galactic threat, a war for their own survival. And now, they were being presented with a conflict on an intergalactic scale, a mystery billions of years old. Humanity's final act was not to hide. The custodian's voice delivered its last, stunning revelation. The great sacrifice was a strategic retreat, a way to preserve our knowledge and our potential to allow the galaxy to mature and unify. We did not vanish. We have been preparing. The pocket dimensions, the sublimated consciousnesses, we have been building, relearning. We have been waiting for allies to emerge. We have been waiting for you. The image of the galactic cluster faded, replaced by the serene, sad face of the custodian on the bridge of the Vigilance. Our war was to defend this galaxy. The next war will be to save another. The choice is no longer simply to survive. It is to answer a call from across the darkness. The age of solitude is over. A new age of galactic partnership must begin. We will await your answer. The connection severed. The data core returned to its gentle, rhythmic pulsing. The chamber of resonant judgment was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of a people staring into a future far grander and more terrifying than they had ever imagined. High Scion Thrax looked at Lyra, at Kale, at the faces of his people, and saw not subjects of a concordance, but the first citizens of a new galactic community. They had opened a tomb and awakened a ghost, only to find that the ghost was not a memory of the dead, but an invitation from the living. Their long, lonely journey through the stars was over. A much larger, much more profound journey was about to begin.